Thank you, Josh, and thank you all for being here this morning. There's nothing like an extreme weather day to talk about climate change, so there's some good going on here. Yeah, and I'll say also, this is like the perfect example of why the term global warming has been so disastrous for building up momentum around climate change, because people say, how can global warming be happening if it's 1 degree out today? It makes no sense. It can't be true. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later, about the communications around climate change and trying to help people to understand that it's about extreme events. And I'm going to be talking specifically about what climate change means for Philadelphia. I love that these conversations are happening today on this topic all over the world. And I'll also talk a little bit about how Philadelphia really is part of a growing national movement of cities who are wrangling with this topic, trying to figure out what it means for us in terms of our communities, our infrastructure, our futures. But I think that even though there's a national dialogue that feels really stunted, there's a lot of activity happening in cities, and I think we're going to be the ones driving this movement. So thank you for joining me today to learn more, and look forward to some Q&A at the end. So for a little bit of brief context, as Josh mentioned, Mayor Nutter, when he took office, had made a number of commitments around sustainability. And back in 2007, 2008, when he was running, this was a fairly new kind of concept for local government. There were some leading cities that were starting to establish offices of sustainability, put out these sustainability plans. And it was really those leading edge cities that were out there first, right? Like our West Coast friends, Chicago, New York City. And when Mayor Bloomberg put out Plan YC in New York, I think it started to feel more relevant for the East Coast context. And Philadelphians really rallied behind that model and came out again and again during that mayor's race to try to get those candidates to commit to taking sustainability on. And so we did. In 2009, we released Greenworks Philadelphia, which is the city's comprehensive sustainability plan. And this was our first time out trying to figure out what sustainability even means as a word, but very much in terms of the context of what people care about in Philadelphia. And so we decided to make it a really broad plan. And we focused the plan around these 5 areas: energy, environment, equity, economy, and engagement. And we set 15 different goals, measurable goals that we could try to start charting progress against to get a sense of where we were trending and what our impact was. And then we committed to over 160 individual initiatives that over Mayor Nutter's time in office, we were committing ourselves to driving forward. And I have some of our annual reports in back in case anyone wants to go home and geek out over the weekend with all of the various details on each of the initiatives. But again, this was the first time we were doing this in city government. So what we started to do is we took this plan, we took these initiatives, and I essentially started mapping it against the city's org chart. So if, we're talking about open space, parks and recreation, let's talk about what your goals and priorities are. How does this fit in? And we started to take the goals from this Greenworks plan and nestle them in homes across government and build up leadership and champions across all of our various departments and agencies so that we were starting to integrate sustainability all over the place. It wasn't just me and our small office taking it on. We knew that that would never work, right? It couldn't just be one person caring about it. We really needed to infuse government with this kind of overall mindset around thinking about outcomes, thinking about more integrated approaches. And so that's kind of what Greenworks has been. And we are now 6 years into the implementation cycle. Our plan goes out to 2015 when Mayor Nutter leaves office. And we're excited to be spending this year sharing out with everyone what we've learned, what our takeaways are, and where we think Philadelphia needs to go next. And at the top of that list is thinking about climate planning and what climate change is meaning for Philadelphia and what we need to do about it, because we need to make some major changes pretty quickly. So what I want to do today is just give a really general overview on this topic. And we commissioned and released a climate science report just a few months ago that you can find on our website if you want to read more about any of the details I'm going into today. It's at our website, phila.gov/green. And what we wanted to know was, in this large conversation about climate change. You know, we know that the Earth is getting warmer. We know that the sea level is rising. But what does that mean for Philadelphia? What does that look like now? What is it going to look like in 20 years? What about 100 years from now? What are these potential scenarios and realities that we need to be planning for? And through our Greenworks planning process, we started to see year after year as we were tracking and reporting data, we started to see some interesting trends emerge. And some of these might seem pretty basic, but until a couple of years ago, we didn't have any data around any of this to let us know what was happening. And one major trend that we started to understand was the tie between weather, energy, and greenhouse gas emissions. So this is a chart here that shows the connection between weather and energy use. So not surprisingly, we are a city that has cold winters and hot summers. And those extreme weather events drive extreme energy use. And there's a direct link then between the weather outside, the energy that our buildings are using, and then what our greenhouse gas emissions profile looks like. So this is how Philly fits in terms of its greenhouse gas emissions profile against other cities. But in Philadelphia, we're actually surprised to learn that the majority of our greenhouse gas emissions come from buildings. Not from the transportation sector, as I think most people assume, but from buildings. And so we started to try to think about what levers city government has, or a city has in general, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And when you think about it, the majority of the population lives in cities, right? And that's a trend that's increasing, mostly in these coastal cities. But if cities are where the majority of greenhouse gases are coming from, and the majority of greenhouse gas emissions are coming from buildings, we need to make a huge push towards building efficiency. But that's not necessarily what the market forces are promoting. Energy prices are really low right now. They have been for a while. And that was an assumption we got totally wrong when we put Greenworks out. We put Greenworks out with the assumption that energy prices were going to be rising, and rising pretty steadily, so that the numbers would finally make sense for energy efficiency and renewable energy, and that didn't really come to fruition. So we're still really struggling with this idea of, at the local level, if greenhouse gas emissions are coming from buildings, what can we as a city government do to promote energy efficiency? It's very basic, but that's kind of where we still are in terms of looking at how cities can derive great emissions reductions. So we also started to look at this kind of weather trend, and we've been seeing a huge spike in the number of extreme weather events in the last couple of years. This is a list of just the kinds of events we've had since 2010. It's pretty amazing. So we've broken all sorts of records in the winter, in the summer. We've even had a derecho, which I didn't even know what that was until we had one. And with each event, you know, it feels kind of traumatic and extreme at the time, and it gets us thinking. And then we kind of go on with our lives and forget about it. And then we have another extreme event. And you've already forgotten the last one, you have the next one. But when you put them all together, it's pretty crazy. And this is very different. And this is what we're starting to realize, that Philadelphia's future is going to have more of these extreme climate and weather events. But we need to understand on what trajectory and then start plotting out the outcomes. So we know that cities are facing climate events and extreme weather events, but the impact on cities is very different, right? So given our unique geography, topography, whatever else, what's happening in Philadelphia, what will happen in Philadelphia, is very different from, say, New York City, Baltimore, Boston. So all of these cities kind of have their own unique context with which they're trying to figure out the issue of climate change. This is a tool that the New York Times put out a couple of years ago, where you can go play with like a drag tool and look at different scenarios and what the inundation and other effects on those different cities is going to be. And this raises a really interesting question, which is, we often think about climate change in terms of all of the negative effects, but one conversation in Philadelphia that we're starting to have is, well, hate to say it out loud, but what are the potential positive effects of climate change? If our neighbors to the north and south, like Baltimore and New York City and Boston and Washington, D.C., who are further towards the coast, if climate change is going to be worse for them, are there potential economic advantages for Philadelphia? Do we become more of a port city? Do we have more transportation and logistics companies that want to route here? Are the risks of location lower here in such an extent that we might have more businesses choose to locate here rather than Baltimore? we don't know yet, but these are the kinds of conversations that we're starting to have and that we need to start thinking about as we start to look at what this climate data means for Philadelphia. So we didn't have any data for Philadelphia. We had national information that general scientific organizations were putting out, but it didn't downscale at all to our city and to our region. So we decided that information needed to exist, and we went out and we commissioned a firm called ICF based here in Philly, and we asked them to work with us and have their climate scientists look at Philadelphia-specific information and to let us know what those climate scenarios might look like. So our charge to them was to take 4 different potential future scenarios and map out what the modeling was against those 4 scenarios for the Philadelphia region specifically. So we looked at 4 different scenarios, and you can see the color coding here. Moderately low emissions, moderately high emissions, and then against 3 different time periods: near term, mid-century, and end of century. And you can see those time periods and how they're defined. So we basically said, let's not take the most liberal and the most conservative assumptions, like, maybe climate change is a problem and oh my God, the world is going to end. Let's take those extremes and put them to the side, and let's look at those more moderate and kind of more conservative but realistic scenarios and map out the data for Philadelphia against those 4 different scenarios. And I'll say that there's been a quickly growing body of knowledge that helps us to do this modeling increasingly accurately. So the scientific community across the world is working together to further refine the tools that help us to get data that we can have better confidence in. So in the last 5 years even, there's been tremendous growth in the quality of the data that we can run these models against. That being said, none of this is certain, right? We can't say with any certainty that we're talking 1 degree or 3 degrees or 1 inch or 3 inches. So all of this is still projections, but they're increasingly accurate projections in terms of the underlying science and data. So we did all of these future scenarios against observed data as our baseline. Observed data being what we have from 1961 to 2000. So we were interested in particular in looking at temperature and precipitation. And this is what you can see here, just with a low and high emission scenario. They clustered pretty naturally and very closely around an increase in temperature and an increase in precipitation. This is against a few more models, and this is looking out mid-century, so you're seeing a steady rise as we get through the decades. And then this is end of century. So what does this mean? I think it means 2 things. One, from a climate scientist perspective, this is a really close clustering. We don't have any outliers, basically. And most places that they run this downscale data for, you'll have outliers that might call into question whether these are the right assumptions. In Philadelphia, there's no doubt, based on the climate science, that Philadelphia's climate future is going to be a hotter and wetter one. There's just very clear clustering around the data that shows that that's our climate future. What does wetter and hotter mean? That's what we needed to know. So we needed to know how to make this data actionable to help start guiding our decision making. So I want to kind of talk about what a couple of degrees means and what a couple of more inches of rain mean over the course of each year. And this is a sea level rise. I'll show 2 more here before we talk about what the implications are. So again, against a couple of different scenarios here, against a couple of different time ranges, a clear trajectory towards increased sea level rise. And this is also connected to another important trend in Philadelphia, which is storm surge. So storm surge are events along the rivers, and they cause extreme tidal flooding in the river ward districts. So this is some work that the Delaware Valley Regional Planning Commission has done around looking at hurricane surge scenarios and with different categories of storms, what those would mean. And what this is really interesting to think about around is just all of the development that's happening on our 2 rivers. That right now is being done without real consideration towards what these future predicted scenarios are. A lot of our development still happens looking at our historic patterns, not looking forward. And this seems really simple, but the way that FEMA does their flood maps, the way that we set flooding insurance is largely around past historic events, not acknowledging that what the last 100 years looked like are entirely different than what the next 100 years are going to look like. So we don't right now look at development in terms of what the next 100-year floodplain is likely going to look like. We look at it in terms of what the existing one based on the last 100 years looks like. So this is, you can see here with category 1, 2, 3, and 4 hurricanes, what neighborhoods in those river wards districts would experience flooding. Another interesting just area to look at here, this is the lower Schuylkill right around here where the Sunoco refineries are and where there's a lot of conversation around building out further energy infrastructure. And that's one area of the city in particular that would see high levels of inundation with different categories of storm surge and hurricanes. So it's going to be hotter. It's going to be wetter. We're going to see more extreme weather both in the summer and in the winter, which kind of blows that whole global warming context out of the water. So we're going to have, actually this weekend is a really good example of what we're concerned about. The low today so far has been 3 degrees. On Sunday, just 2 days from now, the predicted high is 45 degrees. So in both the summer and the winter, we're going to have more quick succession, freeze thaw, hot, hotter, cold, colder days, which is stressing our infrastructure. We've seen this already, right? It feels like every day there's a broken water main, there's a natural gas issue, facades are falling off of buildings, and that's this freeze thaw that's starting to happen. So what we're interested in is taking that climate data and trying to understand what the risks are for Philadelphia. And I'll focus mostly on risks right now and not the opportunity part. But what we're interested in is kind of trying to understand, so what does that mean? So if we have a heat wave, right now if we have one heat wave a summer, so 3 days over 90 degrees, what if we have 2? What does that look like? What if we have more nights that don't get under 90 degrees and so we don't get that relief at night? What does that mean in terms of public health and public safety? What does it mean if we have more cold weather days and more days out of school? Those are the kinds of data points that we need to start mapping out against the city's policy, programming, and operational decision-making structures. And what we're also trying to wrangle with is, what can we as a city government do? If we're acting as an island without anything at the state or federal level, how far can we go in this regard? If we're planning SEPTA for flooding, but we don't have the adequate funding from the Federal Department of Transportation, how much can we do on our own? And where do we really need partnership with the state and federal government? So this is just kind of trying to really, for us, understand what are our responsibilities in all of this? What are our risks? And then against that, what kind of plan can we put in place to start taking this information and then drilling it down to a level that decision makers can start using to start planning for a climate future? So this is an exercise that a lot of cities are going towards, which is, how do we plan for this? So this totally changes how we as a local government work. We don't do integrated long-term planning like this very well. We don't do planning along future impacts very well. How do we take climate data and start figuring out what we at the local level need to do to prepare for climate events and also to contribute towards global greenhouse gas reductions? And right now what scientists are calling for are 80% reductions by 2050, which is crazy. So we've, in Philadelphia, realized since 2006 to 2014, we've seen about 9% reduction in Philadelphia. We had a goal of 20%, so we only got to about half of our goal. And most of that was because of the switching from coal to natural gas. So it was at the grid level more than anything that we were doing. And we're seeing growth in Philadelphia, so we need to figure that out. But cities right now, most cities are not anywhere on pace to reach 80 by 50 reductions. So what we're trying to do is try to understand, how the heck does a city like Philadelphia, city like New York City, achieve deep scale reductions in just a couple of decades? So this is what New York City did, and we're doing something similar right now. Looking at your current baseline and then looking at your business as usual scenario. So if things continue as they are now in terms of grid mix, building use, transportation, level of renewables, et cetera, here's what our emissions scenario will look like. And then starting to build in different things. So, okay, you have energy efficiency building policies, you're doing fuel switching, you're starting to integrate more clean power. We're trying to understand how we would get to an 80 by 50 scenario given the context of a city and the different things that we have control over and don't have control over. And then this is something that we can use to start our federal lobbying, to start our state lobbying, to start working with city departments to figure out if there are new requirements we want to put around development patterns, and really start to drill down this huge concept of climate change into how we drill it down into what it's going to mean for Philadelphia and how we start to make changes to plan for it and to prepare and to protect our city and to thrive in what's going to be a very quickly changing climate in the future. So I know I put a lot of information out there, and I wanted to just give a really broad overview. But I thought I would open it up for questions and ask you all if there are specific areas that you're interested in going into further, if there's questions, comments, ideas, anything. But this is like Climate Change 101. Philadelphia is going to get hotter and wetter. What does that mean? What does that make you all think about? Yeah?
Well, in that huge area of Sunoco, and I don't know if I've ever been in a city where such a great significant part of our city is basically just gone by Sunoco. I know there's a lot of wishful thinking to get them out of there, but that's not going to happen. And considering they're going to be inundated with floods and what already happened at Tinicum with the huge spill, I mean, that just seems disastrous, especially the airports right downstream. Like, doesn't that just seem like a huge catastrophe is coming?
Potentially. I think it's something that folks need to be thinking about. And another interesting part of this is the insurance industry, right? Because the insurance industry is not going to accept the risks of climate change and take on the financial burdens on its own. So the insurance industry, I think, is going to ultimately be moving the national conversation and the politics, because that's already starting to happen a little bit. Like, a lot of businesses are starting to do the risk analysis, and absent of any kind of cap and trade legislation or whatever else, a lot of corporations are starting to look at all of this because they plan 50 and 100 years out. If you own land, you're kind of looking at what if, you know, and if you have a logistics company, you're thinking about all of this. So some of this right sizing, I think, may happen from the insurance industry, but the regulations just aren't there yet. So all of that is regulated at the federal level, not at the city level. So we don't, for example, like rail lines, that's another issue that's been coming up tied to the natural gas industry. We at the local level don't have jurisdiction over those rail lines. So those are federal regulations that are largely getting caught up in some of the federal level issues, but have tremendous local implications for quality of life, health, safety, etc. So I think like that's a great takeaway for you all, is that this is going to have major impacts for our city, and we need to have voice in all of this and have information with which to decide what we think and what we want to do. I think my concern is that there's not a very strong conversation happening in the city right now, looking at all of these potential impacts and what it could mean for us. Yeah.
I had a question. It sounds like you have other counterparts in cities across the U.S. Is there a chance to get together with them to talk through medium, long-term planning? Lessons learned. I know a lot of this stuff is context specific to Philadelphia, each city. But there's got to be a way to maybe share implementation schemes, discussions about how to actually get policy that might have a benefit for another city.
Yeah, so I'm the co-chair of something called the Urban Sustainability Directors Network. If anyone's interested, we're at usdn.org. And it's a peer-to-peer network of my counterparts from about 200 different North American cities. And we are about 5 or 6 years old. So when I first started this job 6 years ago, you know, the Philadelphia story was a very similar story. It was like one person a roll of duct tape, some bubble gum, like a couple cents somewhere in the couch cushions, and this huge mandate around this new field of sustainability. And it felt daunting and lonely and impossible. And we all started to find each other because everyone was overwhelmed and having like some kind of crisis of their own. So we started this network so that we could start sharing information so that we weren't recreating wheels over and over again. And we've built ourselves out over the last 6 years to now be a staffed, funded organization. So we can do all this peer-to-peer learning and sharing. And the conversation that's evolving right now, it started out kind of like, hey, how did you structure your contract for your recycling program? And how are you financing commercial energy efficiency improvements with your federal block grant dollars? Cool. Oh, that's really helpful for our program. We'll take that back. But now we're getting a little bit more sophisticated, and we're thinking about, in the absence of federal requirements or regulations that govern what we do at the local level, how do we fill that gap and start to create some consistency so that how you're counting greenhouse gas emissions in Philadelphia is consistent with what they're doing in DC and New York, so that we can actually compare apples to apples? And how are we doing climate planning? If we're all starting on this road, why don't we figure out what some common standards are so that we're not going off in 12 different directions? So there's a voluntary movement between cities right now to not only share information, but to develop shared tools and practices, to develop a little bit more discipline and rigor, but to build up a lot more consistency, because we're planning for a future, hopefully, where there's more action at the federal level that governs us. So we're trying to kind of anticipate that path forward and self-govern a little bit for now. But I'll say that there's tremendous work happening in cities all across the country. It's really under the radar. We need to figure out how to tell these stories more, because from Oklahoma City to Asheville, North Carolina, work is happening in city governments, and it's because communities care about it and are calling for it, and that's not in the national dialogue at all right now. Yes, sir, Beck.
There seems to be a push-pull inside the government itself. On one hand, a real push, the kind of push you're talking about, to make us more aware of the environmental impacts of our decisions. On the other hand, a real push for economic development, as you allude, the building of 100-year, 200-year buildings along areas of the river, which are going to clearly, within the next 50 to 70 years, be impacted by possible flooding. And it doesn't seem as though forget naturally, inside the city, we've aligned these two dynamics and two urgencies for both.
I would say that's accurate. Yeah, we don't do energy planning right now around private development. I think it's something we need to be talking about. We don't do climate planning. Our zoning code process started in 2007 through 2010. We've got a great updated zoning code. It starts to reflect some of these issues, but that preceded the information that we now have. So I think this is a conversation that we need to drive over the coming decade, and there are changes that are going to need to happen. Obviously, there's resistance. This is a major change, especially if you're a developer. This is a pain. It costs more. You don't even know if it's real or not. There's always that inclination to drive towards the status quo. I think every extreme weather event helps with that education, and that's what the national polling is showing, that in communities all across the country that are starting to experience extreme weather events of their own kind, whether it be the drought out in California, wildfires in Colorado, some of the flooding and snowstorms here on the East Coast, those extreme weather events are what are quickly driving public opinion to change on this topic. But to get the alignment between a fast-changing climate, public opinion, and then policies at the local level, that's a lot. But we need to be on that road to call for that. And there just needs to be a much broader conversation, I think, to help us as a city come up with a common vision and a common purpose around this topic, and then figure out how we need to update the zoning code, bring floodplain standards into our planning process, so on and so forth. So I think it's starting to happen, but the pace, I feel this sense of urgency that doesn't match the pace of change with all of these systems and processes.
Could I just drill a bit more? I live along the school hill, and there's very exciting and very important discussions, Rex and others are having, and about the ways in which they're going to be moving in along the river. To what degree are you and the city government involved in serious conversations that focus the issues at stake as we all begin to think about the possibility of moving the city further towards Historicville and away from that kind of old city structure? Are you in that discussion?
Yeah, I would say those conversations are happening. And listen, we can coexist along our riverfronts. That can happen, but it just requires thoughtful planning, right? So we have this green infrastructure program right now in the city, Green City Clean Waters. We've committed $2 billion over the next 25 years of your ratepayer funds through the water fund to do intensive green infrastructure improvements across the city. Like, that's a conversation right now. We know flooding is a problem. We know it's a problem that's going to get worse. We know that we can help with the heat island effect and some of these high temperature issues with more intensive green infrastructure. So there's a plan. It's 25 years out. It's serious. These conversations are starting to happen. And what we're doing with this climate science data is we're doing basically capacity building workshops. So we're taking this data and going out to each of our departments. The airport was mentioned, the water department, the planning commission, and we're taking the climate science and giving them scenarios from it to say to the health department, for example, if we have 2 more heat waves this summer, looking back at the heat waves of 2013 and 2012, let's look at those real experiences that we had and talk about what that would mean if we doubled that. What would you need in terms of resources? How many more cooling centers would we need for seniors? If we lose the grid 2 days over the summer, what does that mean? So we're now doing that scenario planning and capacity building with departments so that they can take this super wonky information, take it off the graph and into their planning. But we're in the early stages. Do we have time for a last question or two?
Yeah, 2 more questions about it.
So early on you were talking about how a majority of our emissions are coming from buildings. So my 2 questions are, do you know the breakdown commercial versus residential? And is it kind of a normal distribution, or are there a few, is it like good apples and bad apples?
Good question. So we have a very cool data visualization tool that Xavier built for us. If you go to philabenchmarking.org, you can find it there. So this is an example of where we identified a problem, we matched it against what we thought we could do as a local government, and we realized that the majority of those emissions are coming from commercial buildings, so big buildings, institutional, commercial buildings like this across the city, of which there are about 2,200. So working with council, we passed a law 2 years ago. It's a commercial benchmarking and disclosure ordinance. So it requires these 2,200 large, 50,000 square feet and more commercial buildings to annually report using the EPA portfolio manager tool. They have to go through the process of getting their energy building score and then reporting that to the city. And then we make that information publicly available by building and then in aggregate as a way to both build transparency in the marketplace and also force, I mean that in a nice way, building owners to start wrangling with their utility information and their building information, because a lot of people, like, your utility line is like a subline of a subline in your budget, right? Especially with cheap energy prices. It's not the thing that most business owners wake up and think about in the morning, like, gee, how can I make my building more efficient? But in aggregate, it's a major issue for us. So we wanted to start down the road, starting with education and transparency. So we now have 2 years worth of data. Over 90% of buildings have complied with the law, which is awesome. We have 2 years worth of data, and we want to make it real and usable for people. So Xavier helped us visualize it. So you can cruise around the city on a map and go commercial building to commercial building and see what their score is. The average, so it's a 1 to 100 rating, and the average Philadelphia building scores a 63, which is actually 13 points higher than the national median, which we think indicates that old buildings actually are generally better made than some of the newer buildings. But there's tremendous improvement for efficiency. Like 63 is still a far way off from 100. So we now have some information. We're trying to figure out how to take the next step. And we're working right now to expand that law to multi-family, multi-residential units.
Katherine, I'm very inspired by you
Loving change, right? Yes.
How your creativity, your passion has been accepted, welcomed, appreciated, or not in Philadelphia?
I have met way less. So when I took this job, I also took this job in the midst of the recession, when it was like, you know, we were locked up in windowless panic rooms, crunching numbers, figuring out, like, we didn't have a water cooler in the mayor's office for a while because we couldn't pay the bills. So I thought, like, oh my God, in that context, how the heck is anyone going to care about sustainability? It's totally going to be this like add-on thing that is the first issue you peel off. And it's actually been the opposite. I think for two reasons. In government, people go into government, most people go into government because they want to make a positive impact in their community and contribute towards this greater public good. So most people in government are really motivated by the mission of government and are excited if there's kind of an opportunity for them to have a positive impact. Most people want to be a part of that. And I think that the sustainability issue resonates with Philadelphians. Like, we're this, William Penn green country town. We're actually planned with some of the like basic tenets of modern sustainability. Access to open space, walkable neighborhoods, neighborhoods connected by transit. Those are the principles that Philadelphia was built out around and that continue to serve us well. So it's not like we're Dallas or Houston, where this is just so contrary to our city form and to our city culture. There's actually a really nice nexus, I think, with sustainability and some like just very basic concepts that have been in Philadelphia and in government for a long time. So people are into this. Like our colleague in Parks and Recreation, who is in charge of the urban ecosystem, Joan Blaustein, they have a pilot forest, a 100-acre urban forest in the Haddington Woods right now, where they're doing future planting. So they're looking at tree species and purposefully like nurturing an ecosystem that will be viable at end of century. Like Joan did that. I didn't have to go like twist her arm and like wrangle her to the ground to think about how climate affects ecosystem services. There are people all over government who are taking all of this and running way farther than I could even think to. The water department and Green City Clean Waters, they were thinking about green infrastructure 15 years before anyone else would. So there's a ton of innovation, a ton of openness, all in the context of like major resource constraints, which I think is holding back some of the ideas kind of going further than maybe they are in areas, and also like this general market that we exist within. I will say though that the hurdle, and I think where my frustration comes out, are just like the systems, the outdated systems, how we do capital budgeting. We've done it the same way for like 100 years, and it doesn't work anymore for a bunch of different reasons. But we still do it like that because it's just such a beast of a system. Those are the harder, and sometimes I also have come to appreciate that if government reacted to the trend of the day every time, we would be a schizophrenic mess. There are benefits to government being slow and steady and kind of keeping course and staying focused. But there are also major changes that periodically need to be made for government to come into like the current times. Data, and just kind of the whole movement towards, the internet. Like that's a huge thing that we're wrangling with because you have to take payroll and like every different database that's been federated over the last 20 years in an unplanned, cumbersome way. All of a sudden we have to figure out how to merge this in a quickly changing context. So I think that's the frustration, but this is the moment to make those changes. And I think that there's definitely a coalescing of support to make those kinds of changes. And most people get it. It's just like, it's a huge thing. Thank you all.